will the American presidency ever be the same? The answer is absolutely no. We are witnessing changes in presidential power that will last long after President Trump is gone. And this is critical. These increases in power will stay regardless of the political persuasion of the next president. Be it a President Vance or a President AOC, they'll keep what's been taken for the White House. And why? Because nearly every person given power thinks they're the best one to wield it. My predecessor was wrong to take that power, but me? I'll use it properly. I'm a political scientist, studied the American presidency in undergrad and graduate school, recently spoke at the Dole Institute of Politics on this very subject, and I've identified presidential phenomena that are likely here to stay. I believe our moment to be a watershed, as we'll see, one that could be predicted for at least a century. And let's be clear, this isn't about whether things the president is doing are things we agree with or disagree with. This isn't an examination of what is good and what is bad. Part of our job as thinking citizens is to examine whether this is ordinary use of executive power or whether these are new powers of the president. And I think the easiest place to see that distinction is with the power to make laws that spend money. If you took a civics class in school, you know the power to appropriate lies with the Congress of the United States, aka the House of Representatives and the Senate. But after taking office in January 2025, the second Trump administration began dismantling the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Funds were cut off, staff were placed on leave. Eventually, a full-scale restructuring saw 80% of programs eliminated. The scraps dumped into the U.S. State Department. Prior to these actions, Congress passed no law abolishing the agency, and as of writing, Congress has still passed no law abolishing USAID, though funding cuts have been confirmed. As no law has been passed abolishing the agency, and yet it is gone, precedent has been set. One can easily see future presidents abolishing more programs and agencies, likely targets under a future Democratic administration, the expensive programs of the Pentagon or Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE. In fact, I just stopped recording to Google this. Rough budget of USAID, staff plus programs, $40 billion. ICE, their new budget, $45 billion. Hello. Anyone who celebrated the dismantling of USAID should know that if it can be done for you, it can be done to you. More on that in a second. By getting rid of USAID, President Trump has done two things. First, he failed to spend billions of dollars appropriated by Congress, but also two, he effectively passed legislation through the White House, abolishing an agency created by Congress. So on the first thing, failing to spend money. The act by a president to ignore the spending set forth by Congress by law is known as impoundment. Let's be clear, it's not totally new. In 1803, President Jefferson impounded, aka chose not to spend money Congress told him to spend by failing to purchase some gunboats. Jefferson and other presidents have done this impoundment over the centuries on small scales by arguing either A, the issue that caused Congress to spend the money was no longer relevant, or on administrative grounds that made executing the law faithfully complicated. But this form of impoundment is small scale on the margins of federal spending. Hey Congress, the president might say, you appropriated $100. I only spent $99 because, well, that $1 just didn't make sense to spend. Impoundment like this is not without controversy, but is arguably part of the constitutionally expected back and forth between the executive and the legislature. Prior to President Trump, one other president did push impoundment to its limits. President Nixon impounded funds all over the place for a variety of reasons. According to Wikipedia, the greatest source of intellectual altruism in human history, Richard Nixon attempted to impound funds on an environmental project which he opposed, and I was able to confirm elsewhere. Nixon blocked $3 billion for an EPA program to help communities build waste treatment plants. So aggressive was Richard Nixon in thwarting the will of Congress that the Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. The idea was to create procedures so that impoundment could not be done in bad faith, and definitely not to subvert the will of Congress. Congress was placing future presidents on a short leash, and the Constitution backed them up in doing so. Article 1, Section 1, 7, 8, and 9 gives, quote, all legislative powers to the Congress. All taxes, all spending, directed by Congress. And Here's Federalist 58, in which James Madison explains the logic. This power over the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people. A famously originalist justice of the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, confirmed this assessment in 1998, writing, President Nixon asserted at a press conference that his constitutional right to impound appropriated funds was absolutely clear. Our decision, aka the Supreme Court decision 2 years later in Train v. City of New York, proved him wrong. This was a conservative member of the Supreme Court rebuking a Republican president. No, presidents don't decide to spend money or abolish agencies. That power lies with the Congress. That is, until now. President Trump has done similar to his predecessors, albeit on a larger scale, ignoring billions and billions in spending. But he's also done a second thing, a new thing. He's dismantled an agency mandated by Congress. In effect, his executive order on January 20th, 2025, initiating the end of USAID, can be seen as a piece of quasi-legislation. And as the Congress has not chosen to, and as the courts have not been able to stop this, that piece of quasi-legislation is now the law of the land. Here's an important footnote. Whether you thought the ending of USAID was good or bad is not the point here. Future presidents will now feel empowered to attempt this kind of law. Perhaps a Republican-controlled Congress or a conservative Supreme Court will find a rationale to stop a Democratic president from abolishing aid to Israel or dismantling ICE. But this completely backwards dynamic is now available for any president to at least try. It's a new power. I read recently in the news that the Constitution is getting some annotations on its website. Let's add one more asterisk for Article 1. Congress has all legislative powers? Asterisk. Almost all. At least one lies with the president. I think it's useful to place this, what will be a legacy of President Trump's second term, into a theoretical framework, one I first encountered during graduate school at American University here in Washington, D.C. In his book, Presidential Leadership in Political Time, political scientist Stephen Skowronek wrote of 4 broad archetypes of presidential leadership. The first is presidential articulation, as in the case of George H.W. Bush, who entered a system firmly established by a predecessor, in Bush's case, Ronald Reagan. These presidents are status quo types, articulators of the prevailing ideology and power structures. The second archetype is presidential disjunction. Like the first type, these presidents are part of an established system, but that system is showing cracks. Think of the struggles that Herbert Hoover had offering standard answers to the unique challenge of the Great Depression. These leaders caused disjunction with the way things work in Washington, preceding big change. In the case of Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt would take the White House thereafter, completely transforming the relationship between the federal government and the public. The third archetype is preemption. These are the disruptor presidents. Skowronek calls them wild cards. Like Woodrow Wilson or Richard Nixon, these presidents come with a new vision for politics, but hit the hard wall of the established order. President Trump in his first term fits this bill pretty well, often thwarted by the people around him and the Congress. He nonetheless preempted pretty big shocks to the system, which is why I bring up the framework, because I believe in his second term, President Trump is no longer a preemptor president. He is now acting as the fourth archetype, the Reconstruction president. These presidents engage in extensive reconstruction of the terms and conditions of legitimate national government. Even through this one prism we've been examining, President Trump's impoundment of funds and the dismantling of USAID, what I'll call President Trump's executive legislating, President is upending the procedure and guardrails of the previously dominant regime. As Skowronek puts it, order shattering becomes order affirming. And I like that phrasing, order shattering to order affirming. It suggests that this isn't a one-off. We should not expect to go back to the way things were after President Trump leaves office. We should expect future presidents to affirm the new order by continuing to impound funds in great quantities and abolish agencies they don't prefer. And they will do that even if it's done in such a way that the original purveyor and his supporters would disapprove. The attempt now lies in the hands of one person with a pen in the Oval Office, rather than only in the hands of the multitude under the Capitol dome. I guess what I'm saying is that if a Democrat ever returns to the White House, expect a liberal Project 2025, a Project 2029 or 2033, which brings us to the second presidential phenomenon I believe is here to stay. And let me introduce it with a bold statement that will likely short-circuit your brain into a Twister-esque contortion. You ready? President Trump is the most progressive president in the history of the United States. Is your brain circuitry smoking yet? To be clear, this is not an endorsement of President Trump or an assertion that he secretly agrees with the Democrats on reproductive rights or trust busting. Rather, what I will now argue is that President Trump is, for better or worse, the embodiment of the dream of the American presidency, best illustrated through the thoughts and actions of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, progressive lions. Further, that progressive dream, now brought to life, is here to stay. To convince you, I must first show you a term that admittedly even I and my imaginary producer had to Google when we first heard of it. It's unitary executive theory. Unitary executive theory sounds reasonable at first. It says that the president should have full control of the executive branch. That's it. As one advocate told NPR, everyone else in the executive branch, from cabinet secretary down to FBI agent, is a subordinate of the president. The president's branch is the president's to control. The first sentence in Article 2 of the Constitution backs up this disposition. Quote, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Look at the other two branches of government. If Congress didn't control its own committees or set its own agenda, we'd think that was weird. If the Supreme Court didn't schedule its own docket or have the final say on its opinions, we'd raise an eyebrow. Therefore, it follows that the same should be true for the president. If the president doesn't personally control all the people and all the agencies of the executive branch, isn't that a handicap on his legitimate power? And yet the executive has checks all over his branch of government. There are heads of agencies who, at least according to the law, can't be fired except for negligence of duty or malfeasance. There are independent agencies like the Federal Reserve, which have components nominated by the president, but in practice operate independently. And since reforms in the 19th century, we have a nonpartisan bureaucracy, professionals who carry out the will of Congress. They carry out the laws at the direction of the president, but they don't literally answer to him. And mainstream opinion sees the independence of agencies and federal employees as desirable. It can serve as a check on an out-of-control executive like Richard Nixon, burning through attorneys general and deputies in the middle of the night until finding that one lackey willing to break the law. An independent FBI could help prevent political spying on figures like Martin Luther King Jr. An independent Federal Reserve makes economic policies based on the consensus of its board, not on the whims of a president looking for an economic infusion from lower interest rates. An independent Bureau of Labor Statistics can put out jobs reports and core inflation numbers without worrying whether or not it makes the occupant of the White House look good or bad. Okay, that's enough listing. You get the idea. Some independence in the executive branch is clearly virtuous. No, say unitary executive theorists. All this is a big problem. This is the manifestation of faceless bureaucrats, the deep state, thwarting the will of the elected president. The president must be able to tell anyone, even at independent agencies, to do anything at any time, and they must obey. The president must be able to fire anyone at any time for any reason. Only then is the president in full control. Only then is executive power fully vested. And so far in the president's second term, this rejection of limits, this rejection of internal checks on the president's power has been the modus operandi. That's pretentious for a way of doing things. Unchecked presidential power is the name of the game. You might remember the president's firing of 17 inspectors general in the first few days of the administration, but you've likely forgotten he also fired prosecutors involved in January 6 cases, an FBI official for disloyalty, the general counsel of the NLRB, 2 EEOC commissioners, an FEC commissioner, most recently the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics after a weak jobs report. And though it seems like the final line he won't cross, the president has drafted a letter firing the Fed chair. It's not only about firing people. Arguably, the attacks on USAID we've been discussing, attacks on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Education, that would all fit in here as well. Arguably, so would revoking green cards over speech issues, threatening to withhold funding for universities in disloyal states when they need disaster relief. So would running the Justice Department like his personal law firm. And don't forget the actions of DOGE, previously headed by Elon Musk, to run as many federal employees out of town as possible. As Elon said on Twitter, this is the critical battle to restore power to the people from the massive, unelected bureaucracy. And that does seem the best distillation. The president is the elected representative of the people, advocates of unitary executive theory would say. Any check on him within his own branch of government is a handicap on his ability to be able to carry out the people's will. So again, I refocus our thoughts. While it is valid to wonder whether the actions I just listed are good and bad, for the purposes of this conversation, we want to look at the precedent being set. There's another part of the Constitution that's relevant here, Article 2, Section 3, which says, "He, the President, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed." And really, this one sentence undermines unitary executive theory. Congress passes laws, creates agencies, spends money. According to the Constitution, it is the President's job to see that these things are faithfully executed. It's not his job to freestyle and to dictate. Let me put it another way for you. Most of the time, presidents are meant to be middle managers, not autocrats with fiefdoms. The founding generation would mostly agree, with notable dissenters. Alexander Hamilton argued at the Constitutional Convention that the president should be a supreme executive authority. John Adams wanted to call George Washington His Majesty the President, or His High Mightiness the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. But for a new country with a newly gained independence from a king, this was not the prevailing opinion. Not even close. A famous anti-federalist critique began with, "Great powers of the president would bring oppression and ruin." Skepticism of executive power prevailed at the American founding. The presidency was designed as a limited office with checks on nearly every single one of its powers. The idea that the president should be the embodiment of the democratic will of the people would be anathema to the founding generation. Remember Madison in our earlier quote calling the Congress the immediate representatives of the people. The directly elected House, and nowadays the directly elected Senate, these are the immediate representatives of the people, not the president. Further evidence can be found in the way we choose the president. The president is not directly elected. They're chosen indirectly through what we call the Electoral College. Love it or hate it, it's there because the president is not meant to be some man of the people elected by the masses. The opposite is true. The presidency was created, it's in the name, to preside over the laws passed by Congress. Now, admittedly, this vision of a presider president doesn't ring true to our modern ears. We might not look at any president as his high mightiness, but we at least recognize that the president has a big job with a lot of responsibility. More importantly, we're accustomed to presidents being leaders, not faceless pencil pushers. On our national mall, we tend to honor presidents with big personalities leading to big legacies. We have a Lincoln Memorial, not a Chester A. Arthur Memorial, even though Chester A. Arthur was arguably closer to the original vision of the American presidency. So what changed? Obviously, something did. We could spend a lot of time talking about the era of Jacksonian democracy when President Jackson claimed to be a leader close to the people. Jackson aimed to give the individual man a feeling of connection with the president, a feeling that he represented their will against the political elites, against the national bank. But the greatest contribution to the modern American presidency comes from the progressive era, when Theodore Roosevelt used the White House as a bully pulpit to advocate his vision of America. Teddy's role, he thought, was not to wait patiently on Congress, but to push an agenda on behalf of the people himself. His job was to take action in his branch of government and to whip the other branches into following. No progressive thought about this dynamic more than Woodrow Wilson. Even before entering public life, future President Wilson was already thinking of ways to bring the people direct connection to the White House. For President Wilson, it was a shame that most presidents were presiders. He wrote, "The business of the president, occasionally great, is usually not much above routine. Most of the time it is mere administration, mere obedience of directions." He called the parceling of power in the Constitution a, quote, radical defect. He imagined an American parliamentary democracy in which the president acted more like a prime minister in the legislature, setting his agenda, whipping his supporters to pass laws. Wilson wrote in his 1913 book, New Freedom, quote, "When I say bring government back to the people, I want the people to come in and take possession of their own premises. For I hold that the government belongs to the people, and that they have a right to that intimate access to it." The progressive dream was that the president be the embodiment of the democratic will of the people that elected him, to let no constitutional check stand in his way, no special interests, no establishment. If the president were not forcing through his agenda, aka the direct will of the people, he was failing. Wilson said it was the responsibility of the president to be, quote, as big a man as he can be. And doesn't that ring true in our time? Wilson's view was not just influential, it is effectively indistinguishable from the reality of the modern presidency. His vision of a democratic, close to the people president of the United States gradually became what we all expect from a president. Future White House occupants looked to Wilson for a vision of the future they might use. FDR, Kennedy, LBJ, Reagan, Bush, Obama, Biden, these are the inheritors of Wilson's vision. They might have had different policy agendas, but the thing that binds them is that it was their responsibility to chart a vision and advocate it through rhetoric. It was their job to create emotional bonds with the public, to give their supporters the feeling that their guy was in the Oval Office and that they had intimate access. Like fish swimming in water, not aware of what water is, we swim in the dream of Woodrow Wilson, not realizing the American presidency wasn't always infused with this progressive ethos. And today we see the newest generation, Wilsonianism 2.1. By Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson standards, Donald Trump is the most progressive president in American history. In attempting to assert full control through unitary executive theory, in defying 1 out of every 3 court decisions so far, in defying the laws Congress has passed in order to do what his supporters want him to do, completely unchecked, completely unleashed, Donald Trump has taken the mantle of progressivism in a way that would make Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson beam with pride. This is the second way the presidency has changed. Woodrow Wilson's conception has come to full term, and it won't be unbirthed. As predicted by James Caesar in his book Presidential Selection, the last century has gradually given us more Wilson-coded candidates for president as direct democracy has been infused into the primary system our political parties use to select candidates. This in turn has given us more Wilson-coded presidents, and while the trend may ebb and flow, it's irreversible without revolution. It is irrelevant if the next occupant of the White House is of a similar political persuasion to Donald Trump. The next president may inverse those who praise or condemn their actions, but the power will remain in the White House. The powers will remain at the disposal of the presidency as an institution. Future presidents won't be leaving unitary executive theory behind. Just like in the past, presidents didn't stop expanding the use of executive orders. Just as presidents of both parties have kept the war powers in the White House, even though that power explicitly belongs to Congress. And therefore, so too will future presidents bulldoze through their branch of government as President Trump has done. So too will future presidents claim to embody the unfiltered democratic will of the electorate. So too will any overreach be justified, any check on their power a threat to the democratic will of the people. For better or worse, this is the presidency now. So what the hell do we do? So I have a couple thoughts on where we're headed from here. One of them is that there's a deep irony in all of these progressive changes being implemented by an ostensibly conservative government. After all, what could be less small c conservative than colossal executive power? The people surrounding President Trump in his second term are there to ensure that he is unrestrained, yes, but that unrestrained comes from the understanding that what he's unrestrained in doing is the destruction of the administrative state, the deep state. He is giving them conservative policy in a Wilsonian progressive way. It's a paradox. Conservative policy, progressive ways of attaining it. For example, the executive order, which calls for the dismantling of the Department of Education, it espouses a conservative aim, the closing of the Department of Education and returning authority to the states. Power back to the states? That's pretty conservative, right? And yet the way it's being done is progressivism that would make Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson perk up. A president effectively legislating from the Oval Office, pushing through an agenda he believes the people elected him to pursue. As the president told supporters on the campaign trail, "I am your retribution." It doesn't get much more intimate than personal retribution. Having the most progressive president in American history force a conservative agenda on the federal government is certainly a mind bender, but it does remind me of something that the war criminal and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger wrote. Revolutionaries, he says, prevail because the established order is unable to grasp its own vulnerability. This is especially true when the revolutionary emerges, not with a march on the Bastille, but in conservative garb. The people enabling President Trump were open to this revolution because it came in conservative garb. Even unitary executive theory at first glance appears a literalist conservative interpretation of the Constitution. However, the point I'd like to make is that Donald Trump's conservative agenda pushed through by progressive means has opened the path for even more revolution long after he's gone. Maybe the torch will be carried by a national conservative dedicated to his legacy. Maybe. But President Trump's progressive peers Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, FDR, these were not men of conservative government. These men who through force of will conducted extensive reconstruction of the terms and conditions of legitimate national government, they didn't do it to serve a vision of the federal government that would be in comportment with the Heritage Foundation or the Federalist Society. What I'm saying is that President Trump is potentially setting the bar for progressive uses of executive power. He used it to destroy. Someone else might come along and use it to build. That liberal Project 2033, should ideological rivals ever retake the White House, might surpass Donald Trump in uses of progressive power. They might build a new Leviathan, the nightmare of the people cheering on Trump's unchecked power today. It can go both ways, which leads me to my second takeaway. How should we feel about this as citizens? In this video, we've left the day-to-day politics to the side to take a bird's eye view of the presidency, and I hope you can now see how this expansion of executive power could serve more than one ideological framework. In fact, it's probably better suited to the opposite ideology than to the one currently occupying 1600 Pennsylvania. So what should we be advocating as responsible citizens? Should we be voting in presidential primaries for candidates who promise to take us back in time to a more restrained presidency, who offer us a 20th century presidency or a 19th century pencil pusher administrative presidency? My buddy Mr. Beat and I were discussing this back in March at the Dole Institute. Okay, well, it was his studio because the Dole Institute was snowed in. Nonetheless, we were discussing this and our opinions parted ways. Matt riffed that given these dynamics, his preference for the future would be to bring the presidency back in check. If he were sitting right here to speak for himself, maybe he'll leave a comment below. I'm sure that his preferred path would be something like a renaissance in the power of Congress and more internal checks within the executive branch on the presidency. But back then I offered, and today I continue to offer, a different opinion. So back in March, I said this: I think it is the responsibility of presidents who come with this extraordinary power to decide what to do with it. I don't think you turn back the clock. And that's still my opinion these months later. These developments in the presidency seem new, but are over a century in the making. Great presidents don't turn back the clock, they accept the ecosystem into which they acquire power. Think of Abraham Lincoln, inarguably a great president in the sense of remarkable and distinguished. Abraham Lincoln expanded presidential power in the emergency of the Civil War. For this, he still sometimes receives criticism for being an autocrat. He arrested political opponents, waged war on citizens, suspended habeas corpus, and ended slavery in the rebelling South with the stroke of his pen as commander-in-chief, with no law from Congress involved. Nonetheless, in my opinion, and most people's opinion, Abraham Lincoln's legacy is nonetheless one of virtue. His use of expanded powers were proportional to the emergency at hand, towards the ideals of the American project, towards what George Washington called our one common country. This is why Abraham Lincoln's presidency is not decried for his use of executive power. It is correct, not hagiography, to call Abraham Lincoln great. Our system of government is a republic with democratic elements. To have elected representatives is to offer fallible, flawed human beings real power. Abraham Lincoln was one of those people, and in my opinion, that trust was well vested. That is our job as citizens going forward. It is not to ask future presidents to take the White House back in time. It is to seek virtuous leaders who will enter the White House and further the American project within the new paradigm. To accomplish this is no easy task, for it requires us as citizens to be virtuous as well. How else might we find those with virtue to lead us? The topic of citizenship is front of mind for me right now. That's why I just started a new series on my Substack exploring holistically the idea of being a citizen. Check it out. It's free. Join us in avoiding despair through the belief that somewhere between completely isolating ourselves from society and completely bending society to our will is a better future for all. Heads held high. Happy warriors. Later, y'all.